Hello all, welcome to the next video in this TCP series. Today we will discuss about TCP flow control. But before we move on to the discussion of TCP flow control, I would like to first discuss or give a short explanation on something called as window or a buffer in our TCP. So you can think of this buffer or a window as your storage. So you have a USB drive or you have a hard drive, etc. All of them contain some storage capacity. So as you fill in more data into these drives, right, the storage capacity of these drives become less, right? And that is what your PC also shows once you plug them into your USB port. So similarly, in your TCP, you have something called as a window. Instead of storage, you call it as a window. Based on this window, your sender or the receiver can accept data. So that is what we will discuss now. So this window is actually negotiated during our three-way TCP establishment. So what happens during the establishment? The sender first sends a SYN message, correct? A SYN message along with a sequence number, and then the receiver sends a SYN and ACK message. SYN plus acknowledgement message, right? With an acknowledgement number. Usually the sequence number is 0 and the acknowledgement number is 1. But along with this SYN ACK, the receiver also tells its window size or its buffer size or the storage size or the capacity. So for example, let's assume that the window size here of the receiver is 100 equals to 100. This is sent to the sender. The sender receives this and sends an acknowledgement. This acknowledgement is for everything that the receiver has just said. So for example, here we have taken the receiver's storage size or the buffer size as 100, but the sender's buffer size is 150. So what usually happens is that the sender has to accept the window size that the receiver has mentioned, because if the sender sends some data of 150 bytes long, the receiver can only accept 100 bytes, correct? So the remaining 50 bytes is lost. That is not the fault of receiver. The receiver has already said that I can only accept 100 bytes of information, so you should have sent only 100 bytes. If you send me more than that, I will not be able to accept it. So send me data that have only 100 bytes in them. This is what the receive window says. Okay, now automatically what happens is that the sender has to accept what the receiver has said. So the sender window also becomes the receive window or the receiver window. So sender acknowledges what the receiver has said and starts to send data that are only 100 bytes long. Now let us take an example where the TCP establishment has already happened and the sender and the receiver are exchanging information or data between them. So let us assume that, let us assume, okay, let us assume that the sender first sends a data, right, of 40 bytes long. The length of this data is 40 bytes. We are again assuming the same thing, that the receiver says I have only 100 bytes of storage, but the sender says I have 150 bytes, but the sender has agreed that he cannot send more than 100 bytes of data. So when this data that is 40 bytes long is received, the receiver acknowledges, With this acknowledgement, with this acknowledgement, it says that now the window size or my buffer size has reduced to 60 because it had 100 bytes of storage, then it received 40 bytes of information. So the remaining storage capacity that it has is of only 60 bytes. Correct. Now it is not necessary that these 40 bytes that are received is right away sent to the receiving application. It is not necessary. So what the receiver does is it stores these received data in its buffer as shown here in green. So this green means in the receiver side, the green means these are the stored data or the received data, and they are waiting for the application layer to ask the TCP process to send these stored data to it. Okay. Now the receiver says I have only 60 bytes of data left. Okay. So automatically now what the sender does is sender again sends a data that is of 40 length of 40 bytes length. So now it had 60 bytes of storage. Now it has received another 40 bytes of information. So the remaining is only 20 bytes. So when the receiver acknowledges it, it says that now my receive window is only 20 bytes. Okay, so the next time the sender is sending some data, it cannot send more than 20 bytes. It cannot send more than 20 bytes. So once this 20 bytes is also received, the storage of the TCP buffer, so the buffer size of this receiver side becomes 0 bytes. And the receiver tells the sender that now I have no window size left. So you cannot send me further information. Okay. Now, when can the TCP process again start to send information? That is only possible when the receiver application starts to pull data from the buffer. Once the application starts to receive data from the buffer size increases, and the receiver then says, hey, now I have more storage, so my receive window is 40 bytes now. Okay, 40 bytes now. So meaning that 40 bytes of data was pulled from the buffer. Okay, was pulled from the buffer. So there is still 60 bytes of data remaining in the buffer, but the other 40 bytes has been pulled by the application. Okay, so the receiver says I have 40 bytes left. Now you can send me few more information if you have. So the sender starts to send or exchange information with the receiver again. Now let me explain you what are these colored boxes here or chambers here and why are they so important to understand. So these colored boxes here, as you can see, I have mentioned that the green ones, okay, the green ones are the data that have been sent by the sender application or the sender TCP process and are waiting for an acknowledgement from the TCP process, so, from the receiver side. So once that means they are sent, the TCP process does not have to worry about them. It's just waiting for an acknowledgement. Once an acknowledgement is received for these sent data, these buffers or these chambers will be emptied. Okay. The next is the yellow ones. That means these segments are not sent, right? So they are still in the buffer and they are waiting to be sent. Okay. So once an acknowledgement for the previously sent data is received, these data, these information will be sent. Now, the ones that are in red, meaning that they cannot be sent. Why cannot they be sent? We will understand this now. So instead of thinking them in a wheel manner or a spherical manner, let us think that these buffers are in linear position. Okay, here is where the concept of sliding window comes. With sliding window comes a lot of confusion. People have difficulty understanding what sliding window actually means. Sliding window is very simple. So after the receiver says that this is my window size, for example, here the window size as mentioned by the receiver was 100. That is what we took as an example, right? It said that is my window size. So obviously sender also thinks that the window size, that the maximum amount of data that I can send is only 100, right? So now here this is the actual window size that the sender has. Okay, that the sender has. Now when does this come into picture? So let us take an example where the information is already exchanged between these guys. Okay, so he sent the sender sent a data of 40 bytes first, right? Then the receiver said, now I have only 60 bytes of receive window. Okay, 60 bytes of receive window. Okay, now what happens again? The sender sends a data of 40 bytes long. Now the receiver says the receive window that I have is of 20 bytes. Now take this into picture, only this condition into picture. Okay, the first what happened is that these green ones that you see here, these green ones are these 40 bytes of data. These are these 40 bytes of data which are sent and are waiting for an acknowledgement, and are waiting for an acknowledgement. Okay, so that these can be emptied. Now these buffers, okay, this one 40 bytes of information, this 40 bytes of information is this 40 bytes which is again waiting for this acknowledgement to be received. The moment this acknowledgement is received, right, this data will be sent and they will also turn into green. Okay, now consider this situation where 40 bytes of information has to be sent. Okay, 40 bytes of information has to be sent, but it cannot send because the receive window in the last acknowledgement was only 20 bytes. So the sender TCP process has created a 40 bytes of segment. It has created a 40 bytes of segment, but here it can only send 20 bytes of information. The rest of the 20 bytes it cannot send because that's what the receive window is. Correct? That's what the receive window is. Now here what happens, in this receiving side it just has 20 bytes of information. Now the application layer, it pulled out some more data. It pulled out 20 bytes of data, right? It pulled out 20 bytes of data. So it automatically has 40 bytes of storage now, right? So what happens? The receiver says, hi, now I have 40 bytes of receive window, right? I have 40 bytes of receive window. So what happens is that this window that was created by the sender side, this window automatically slides towards the right. It slides towards the right. Then what happens? It can send the information or the data that is stored in its buffer, right? So whichever data it cannot send, right, because of the receive window limitation. Now, since the receive window has more data or more buffer in it, it can send all the remaining data into it. So the window actually starts to slide, and this is what is called as sliding window. So here what happens is that this sliding window, okay, eventually will also get emptied, because once it starts to receive the acknowledgement from the receiver, of course these data are unnecessarily being stored in the buffer, right? So the buffer, what it will do, it will release these data from its buffer, and it can fill in new information. So the window actually keeps sliding, and this is what you call as sliding window concept. And how TCP flow uses this sliding window, this is what we have understood now. So I hope this was an informational video. Have a good day.